Good evening, everyone. Hello. My name is Matthijs van der Zanden. I teach political philosophy at Radboud University, and it is my honor and pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker to you, who, as you know, is Eva von Redecker, who is a philosopher and non-fiction writer who worked at many universities in Germany and abroad, and who is now based in rural Brandenburg, where she works in a living community. She's published many books on radical philosophy, which have appeared in many translations, many of them also in Dutch, several of them in Dutch. Among them are Praxis und Revolution, Bleibe Freiheit, and Revolution für das Leben, which is the book that was most recently translated to Dutch by the International School for Philosophy, and it's in light of that publication that she is here with us today. Eva, according to her website, doesn't like traveling, so I'm very glad that she made an exception for us, and that she's kicking off her tour through the Netherlands here in Nijmegen. She will be speaking for about 40 minutes, then we'll have a conversation, and of course afterwards I'll open the floor for questions from the audience, so we'll have a Q&A at the end. But without further ado, let me introduce you, Eva.
Thank you so much. And also thank you for having me here in this amazing theater where I think you should be expecting a film like cinema and not philosophy. So thanks for coming. I thought I'd start this way. Philosophers are really weird. They're weird in many ways, but I'm gonna delve a tiny bit into one way in which they're weird, and that's that they're weird because they always talk about invisible things. And obviously that's not specific to philosophers. Other people do too, like religions talk about invisible things. Poets do. Conspiracy theorists do. But philosophers really make a living of it. And philosophers talk about invisible things in a kind of peculiar way because they're really serious about them. They really think they are not something completely different, but they are what helps us understand the visible stuff. That's even true, you know, of course, like if you've been to the school of philosophy, you've learned that Plato would like think that the ideas are more real than the appearances. But even someone like Marx thinks that you only truly see something or understand something when you've also elaborated the invisible bits about it. For those who want to read more about it, there's a very beautiful preface to the English retranslation of Marx's Capital by Wendy Brown. It's also freely available on the internet, where she develops on this theme that, you know, theory, theoria in Greek, comes from seeing from afar, from the desire to see. It's kind of, you know, I always say if philosophers have hungry eyes, we want to see more than there is to see. So what is it? Because the idea that especially somebody like Marx, whom you would think of as the most materialist philosopher, had is that when we see just with the naked eye, we see lots of separate things. We see objects that are present, but we do not see the relations, kind of what connects them. And also we do not see their emergence. Another way to say what dialectical thinking is would be to say thinking about the connections and the development or the emergence of things. So you do not see, when you see the chair, that it was built by human labor or by factories. You do not see the plastic coming from fossilized carbon, like, you know, 40 billion years of plants that once stored the sun in them. So there are lots of things that we don't see unless we have concepts to bring them about or to draw the connection between something that seems very different, some plant that wasn't eaten by a dinosaur, and the plastic in the chair. So what philosophers really work on are concepts. They work on this stuff that helps you see more about the real stuff. And they even think that that's not just a poetic exercise, though it sometimes also is, but that this is what makes you grasp the world we live in the most realistic way, which is, of course, the only way that allows you to modify it. And I do think that's sort of particularly pertinent at the moment, where we are more and more flooded with sort of virtual realities, with sort of AI-generated imagery of the world, or bits of it, or with discourse that is just resampled old language and not conceptual thinking. So all this to say a bit what I'm doing, but also to apologize that, you know, it's going to be very abstract. It's like, even though the title is very gritty and it's about capitalism and domination, it's actually really just about the concept of capitalism. But I hope it allows you to see things that you couldn't see with a different concept of capitalism. And maybe one way to introduce how what I try in this book to bring into light about capitalism is something that is already folded in the name itself, and capitalism, namely the first part, the cap, which comes from caput, which is Latin, and which means property, or rather head. So let's stay with the property. The shortest summary of what's sort of special about my attempt to theorize capitalism is that it puts a lot of emphasis on property, not just on the distribution of property. I mean, you would be like, okay, what else is new? Like, every Marxist cares about property, right? But not just about who has what, but what having means. What do we understand as property? What does it allow us to do? What are the entailments? So I'm going to get to that in a second. But this, if you sort of take the caput in capitalism seriously, then you have the property already in there in the name. Also, as I said, it means head, but it means usually head of cattle, because that's how kind of the Roman concept of property evolved from counting the head of how many cows you owned. And so caput comes from the counted heads, as it were. One could also say that that's in itself quite a speaking name for a system of domination, because, of course, another way to say that is chattel. That's another way for the head of cattle, and it's the word for the chattel slavery. So where sort of enslaved black people were treated as mobile, fungible goods and commodities. So the account of capitalism I'm giving is, so for those in the audience who are into those debates, also trying to capture some of the insights that theories of racial capitalism usually try to cover, where you try to say that the forms of social domination that have shaped modernity are not completely sort of separate from our economic system and the commodity production. I also sometimes have a joking way of saying, if you focus on the caput in capitalism, then you can think of it as, you know, this kind of skull sign that you have on toxic materials, like it says, beware, you know, this might be poisonous. And I don't even think that all forms of capitalism absolutely necessarily are poisonous, but this kind of caput capitalism that we've built is objectively toxic and poisonous for all the living environment by now. So with the onset of the sixth mass extinction and climate change, we really have developed something that looks pretty destructive. And in a way, that is the overarching horizon, or the thesis of the concept I want to develop, that it doesn't emphasize so much that capitalism exploits labor. It also does that, but that it also really destroys life. And why it would do that, I think, becomes only visible if you focus on the particular form of property that kind of preceded it and catalyzed it and was kind of amplified and proliferated by capitalism. If we think back about like my introduction with concepts making invisible things visible, then of course one of the most classic examples of that type of theorizing when one thinks about capitalism is what Marx did in analyzing the commodity. So he did exactly kind of, well, not exactly, he did a way more insightful and sophisticated analysis than I just did of the chair about the commodity, where he says with the naked eye you think it's a thing, and you think it's worth something, it has value, it just floats around. That's what wealth consists in, lots and lots of commodities. Whereas if you start analyzing what commodities actually are, you understand, and if you have a concept of surplus value, so of the value that is generated when labor is sold to the owners of capital, then you suddenly see that the commodity actually is a sort of, it's almost like a miniature of all the social relations. It only comes about because we work in certain ways of division of labor on specialized tasks, and also because we are cut off from the ownership of the means of production, cut off from the power to control what we produce. It's left to the market. So, you know, if it's not profitable, nobody buys those chairs. If the company is bankrupt, there's kind of no control over that. So he makes commodity into a very rich relational entity that then allows him to analyze what this form of, as he calls it, mute compulsion or anonymous rule of the market over people actually is. That is capitalism. So that's sort of his analysis. And I think that if we want to understand the world we live in, we have to enrich and also sort of somewhat turn upside down this narrow focus on the commodity as what crystallizes all our social relations, and accompany it with a focus on property, which is something that the sort of the early Marx was fascinated by, but the mature Marx really left behind, because you have, of course, all that consideration of who owns capital, who owns the means of production, but as I said earlier, not what owning means. And also when Marx talks about, as he famously does at in the last chapter of the Capital, on the sort of appropriation and dispossession that preceded, in his view, capitalism, the so-called primitive accumulation, he talks about a process of enclosure and land theft that changed again who owned what, and that destroyed collective ownership and installed private ownership over, for instance, common grazing grounds. But he didn't quite see that in that process, sort of in the course of early modern history, which of course was also the period of beginning colonization, it actually, the thing that also changed is what owning meant. So in that period, we slowly have the emergence of a new form of ownership, a new concept of ownership, something that didn't exist in world history before. And Marx actually wasn't aware of that part because, like, he copied from Proudhon the mistake that he thought that in Roman law there was already the exact same property law that we had in modernity. And I mean, you know, that's a really very intricate debate, but I'm convinced by the people who say, no, that it's not the case. Only modernity has this very specific, now to us completely obvious notion of property, which entails that if you own something, you can do with it whatever you want. So you have the right to fully dispose over something, including destroying it. Because you might now think, oh, I have a listed building, or I have that tree in my garden. What are you talking about? I'm not at all allowed to do what I want with it. There are all those regulations. But the fact that those have to be made explicit already shows that the sort of default assumption is, if it's mine, I have to justify myself to nobody. I can do what I want. And that's, of course, completely benign with this glass. You know, if it's mine, I can break it, so what? But with a lot of things, it comes with a lot more problems. So the modern form of property and the modern form of property alone has this promise that you have full volition. You have completely free control over an object, over a bounded object. That it of course needs to be clearly delineated, otherwise we kind of sink in chaos if everybody does whatever they want with everything. But that's a new historical form. It didn't exist, definitely not in sort of non-European societies. Also, it didn't exist in feudalism. So not that feudalism was a great property order. But in feudalism, you didn't even have a general term for property. So there wasn't such a thing as a concept of property that was organized in the same way everywhere. And sort of every jurisdiction, there were different traditions, customs, different, like you always needed lots of piles of old, what's the word for it, paperwork that, Urkunden in German, that sort of pledged to who was allowed to do what, and you had the property not as your personal property, but as something that you were sort of was passed on by the crown. So it wasn't yours to do whatever you wanted with it. You couldn't set your castle on fire. You had to kind of pass it on to the next generation. So lots of a very different and a very non-universalized property regime. And what happened with and also the word, the distinction between ruling over things and ruling over people didn't exist yet. So if you were feudal lord over a certain territory, then you ruled the forest and the deer as you ruled the villagers. Not total, but like quite drastically, and there was no distinction. And then one way to describe the onset of modern social relations, or the sort of official way to describe it, is to say, actually, there started to be a distinction between the rule over things and the rule over people. And with the beginning of early contract theories, sort of end of traditional and justification of the rule of kings, we had the new criterion that rule over people, which was in Latin imperium, needed to be consensual, at least in some fictitious way, not really, not what we mean by consent now, but some idea of the social contract where you had a justification for why you should, in principle, want for there to be a government that has control over you. For instance, because it protects everybody's property and it makes sure that nobody robs yours. I mean, that's kind of, in a nutshell, the most pertinent definition. So you need to, but it's new that you need to have a kind of extra level of justification for rule over people. Not so for rule over things. That's not imperium, but dominion. The rule over things became really intensified. So slowly over the course of modernity, this new idea that you were allowed to also abuse and destroy what you owned became ever more institutionalized. It was, of course, most drastically sort of tried out and implemented in the areas that were treated as kind of populated by non-owners, so in the colonies, and where there was a kind of alleged tabula rasa to completely freely institute those property regimes, but also at home, sort of in, for instance, the disownment of the peasant commons, you had this sort of slow implementation of the new form or new order of property that gave owners this power. And of course you would think that that's really bad for the non-owners. Like, why did they let that happen? Because now, like, they were driven off their land and people who owned could do even more with what they owned. They had this new idea of full dominion. And from the philosophical tradition that I come from, one of the most important concepts that we have in the Frankfurt School is ideology, which is when you try to figure out what is it that makes people somewhat content with or satisfied with the domination over them. And I think most or almost all modern ideologies actually have the form of fantasized or compensatory property. So even the non-owning people in the beginning of modernity were actually given a property, namely the property in themselves. And if you come from serfdom, and if you have the contrast of slavery, that's a huge thing. That's a kind of new freedom. And even to be seen as somebody who could, in theory, own something in this wild new form where you're allowed to do whatever you want with it is a huge privilege compared to a sort of feudal serf who can just, do his his duties on the manor's grounds. So at the same time, there is a promise of a new unrestrained freedom in the world as there is a big dispossession taking place. And this this new sort of promise of having ownership over your own body is of course one that is very unstable, because we don't really own ourselves. It's very weird. Like, where does it start and end? Like, if like, does the head own the body, but then you're tired or you're sweaty or you're pregnant and you stop? Like, it doesn't feel like you're controlling everything. So it's actually not a relation that we can ever fully satisfy just in our own bodies, this fantasy of self-ownership, of full sovereignty, which I think was sort of further fuel to social relations that made the pretty picture that I just described, where you have the rule over people that has to be consensual and the rule over things that is intensified and total, much messier. Because in fact, in real history, there were forms of social domination in between, forms of social domination that also kind of Marx and Orthodox Marxists were pretty blind to, where certain people or certain lives were not treated as those of potential owners that need to be respected and that need to consent to the rule over them, but more like as things or as property. Like, that's what social relation in modernity consists in. Of course, we had, for instance, patriarchy. Like, depending on how you want to tell the story, you could say it's been there for 6,000 years. Definitely wasn't invented by capitalism. That would be absurd. But there is a new form of patriarchy in modernity, which is mediated, so which gets its shape from the property relation, where legally, like just explicitly in law, the husband, in marrying his wife, gains ownership title over certain parts of her life, not over the whole person. I mean, if she's not enslaved, then not over the whole person and body, but you had the right to work, to reproductive labor, sexual access, you had the right to the actual property of the wife. So the kind of 18th, 19th century marriage law, marriage under coverture, was an explicit property institution. And race relations, even more drastically, were kind of shaped or brought about by propertization, by the kind of insurance of your white body of not being enslaved, something that wasn't always clear, but so, for instance, for the US South in the 17th century, then there started to be laws that forbid slavery against white people and made the propertizability of bodies, so the kind of marker of race, and black bodies could be enslaved. So you actually have I would say, a relation of fictitious property, where something that could never really be a thing. I mean, obviously enslaved people remain agentic, remain subjects. They aren't things, can nevertheless, in a certain legal arrangement, be treated as though they are things. And this sort of history is one where we see a sort of, mode of relating to objects that ecofeminists describe as the death of nature. So this idea of sort of man controlling nature and treating it as if it's dead, where we see that mirrored also in social relations. One way to say that you can treat something in whatever way you want is to say that you treat it as proto-dead or as even killable. And you could say that in every relation of domination, you kind of create something like a dead spot or a sort of frozen spot in the object that is treated as if they were property, even if they're not. So what's it got to do with capitalism now? I usually say that you can explain what capitalism does, if you want a real shortcut, by two cuts. So the first cut, that's nice that people are coming and not going. Welcome. So here comes the cookie cutter theory, the cookie cutter theory of capitalism. I've just given you the very long version of the first cut. That's the cut that creates property. So you cut out something and treat it as abusable and controllable. It's like, it's a round, that's why I say cookie cutter, it cuts an object sort of all around. And thereby, things only in the first place become movable, controllable. You can take them out of their context. So what I just said about seeing all the relations and how, like, what contributes to making something the object it is, because it's embedded in lots of connections, which of course is very true. Well, it's true for humans. It's also very true for natural resources. You don't have land is not just a parcel of earth. It's connected to the forest and the cloud and the sort of life in the soil. But if you treat it as property, you can kind of draw a circle and say, this parcel is one unit, and we can now start, for instance, trading it. So there is no commodity without the presupposed property. That's, in a way, the kind of preceding cut. But then there is a second cut that capitalism does, and that's what brings us back to the commodity, which I have at first kind of said, Marx talks about it, I talk about something else. But there is something that I think Marx didn't quite get about how commodification functions. And that, again, you can derive from an analysis of what modern property allows you to do. Because the second cut, so you first have those isolated objects, and now you make them into commodities. How does that work? Well, obviously, you try to make them sellable, right? You hope that there will be worth. You work on them in some way, or you just transport them from here to there, and you just wrap them in plastic foil or wooden crate, and you hope that somebody will pay for it. So there's one part of commodification that very clearly is sort of marketization in the sense of hoping that something will be valuable, like speculatively value it. But that never happens without discarding something else. There's always something that is nullified in the process. You never produce something sort of for the market without producing something for the dustbin. And that's the second cut, which is more like a cut through the object. We have the bounded object, and then you cut through. In a way, that's what labor really is. It's the separation of what might have value, and that will need to be proven in the market relation and the exchange relations, and that which has no value. I think there's hardly, we can think about, maybe we come up with one or two things, but there's hardly any labor process, definitely none once you start competing for cutting the costs of production. There's hardly any production process that doesn't leave some kind of debris or leftover. And you could think, well, that, I don't know, like that can be very benign things, like whatever, if asparagus that is pre-peeled brings you more money, then you just throw the peel on the compost, like not much toxin produced there. But almost all production processes over the last 150 years, for instance, were driven by fossil power. So the energy invested in the production left something in the atmosphere of which we now know it's not gone. It's still there. And almost all production sites are contaminated with toxins. And almost all modern agriculture treats land in a way that will sort of in quite a few decades, not more than that, make it into sort of infertile, vast areas. So there's a sort of constant discarding of something that is not seen as having any value anymore. That's only possible because there is another right that goes along with modern property, which is the right to alienate. It seems completely obvious. I mean, otherwise you couldn't have a market. Like, in order to sell something, you need to be allowed to alienate it, to give it onwards. But if you think about it, it is a very weird right. Like, if we live together and I leave my completely torn T-shirt on the sofa, and then you're like, Eva, can you tidy away your T-shirt? I can't just say, oh, I donated to you, it's yours now, bye. You wouldn't let that happen. But that's how we've organized systematically our production chains, that people can just throw things back into the natural life cycles as if they didn't exist. Like, the CO2, it's just there. Or pollution in a river, it's just there. And then you very slowly catch up with some regulation, which is of course possible, that always comes after, while sort of companies who compete for reducing the production costs are already trying to cut off something else. And of course, one thing that is cut off goes straight through the bodies of people. So the time in which we are not productive is split off and devalued, or the time in which we are not optimizing ourselves is devalued in that way. If we are gendered, then some part of our body is like, that would better not be there, those kilos, for instance. We've so assumed this way of seeing the world, where you kind of cut it into valuable and unvaluable stuff. And it's of course something that reappears dramatically in racism and sort of biopolitics, that deems some populations worthy to live and others unworthy to live in migration regimes, that it's sort of an ever recurring property logic of not, as I said with the first cut, objectifying, but as rendering certain aspects of life abject. So it's not even something that I exploit, it's something that I just sort of reject or discard. And if we say, okay, that's what modern property allows you to do, and that's what merges with a profit-oriented capitalist commodity production, then a lot of the stuff that we might want to criticize as social justice activists and from many different angles actually comes to stand as more as a sort of internal aspect of the system, yet it's not derived from it. So it's not that because there are commodities, do you need to propertize some people? No, some people were propertized, and then that was really practical for commodity production because, for instance, their labor was worth less, or because they did some labor anyway for free because it was already used to compensate some non-owners so that they would spend their days laboring away in factories. So there is a way in which the systems, the elements in the system interlock, but it's not a predetermined way. That's at least the sort of attempt of such a theory architecture. Now, of course, the question of such an analysis always is, well, what we're going to do about it. So now what? It's an even bleaker picture. We have capitalism with this kind of toxic skull on it. We've maybe accepted that some of the domination we see is actually not just human cruelty, or old traditions, but it's a way of modeling our social relations on the example of property. Then how do we resist that? And I think that we can actually see in a lot of recent social movements that they really mobilize not from injustice in distribution, though they care about it, not from differential rights, like civil rights movements would, but really from the question of life or death. That we have many examples of politicization that really start from the protests against certain types of systematic violence or death dealing. You see it very clearly in feminism, especially in Latin America, where it's such a mass movement, but also here in Italy, where femicides are the starting point to mobilize for feminist change. And with Black Lives Matter, then the deaths at the deaths by police violence, the police murders of Black people, that was kind of the starting point to mobilize. It was really the kind of letting die or the making life unlivable that started off the activism, just as a lot of green eco-activism starts from this horror of extinction. I mean, Extinction Rebellion even has it in the name, but this idea that we are actually living now in a way where the way we are reproducing our species destroys the conditions for many other species' life. That's also a sort of death politics that starts off the resistance for a more livable world. I also had it in the Iranian feminist rebellion, where the state femicide of when I speak different languages, I can never get the names. Gina Armini, was seen as the kind of starting point for a new mobilization of, under the slogan of Woman, Life, Freedom, where it sort of started off with a protest for life or against death for life. So I think that's not a coincidence, and I think those movements aren't just like, and of course we have it in the pro-Palestinian activism at the moment, you know, like unfolding genocide in front of our eyes starts off a whole new wave of activism. So we have a kind of very, it would seem bleak, focus on stopping death and stopping systematic death. But if it is systematic, then it also comes with a promise of a different life, of better hopes for shared and, as it were, a non-cut life. And so I think the guiding, if one tries to articulate or interpret contemporary activism, and of course that's always sort of guesswork and it can change its face, and also they can say, well, go away, you philosopher, we define ourselves who we are, you know. But I think one way to capture what's going on in this cycle of movement is to say that there is a fight for a sort of readoption and liberation of the things or the people that were either propertized, that were forced into objectifying, submitted, oppressed identities, and against the discarding or the splitting off of the invaluable. So we have a sort of resistance against those systematic cuts that are again and again and again dealt out by colonial capitalist modernity. And we could call it, you know, Marxists, their concept, the Marxist concept of revolution is one of reappropriation of the world. That's how you overcome alienation, that you sort of reappropriate the social relations, is how you overcome the exploitation, that you reappropriate the factories. And well, you might have guessed by now that I find appropriation a problematic term in all its guises, but also it's unfortunately not the world we live in anymore. Like, there aren't just riches to reappropriate, you know. There's a very damaged and broken planet, lots of toxins that traumatized people, broken social relations. So you can't just be like, hey, great, we reappropriate all that. Also, the fantasy that we would ever reappropriate the powers we've unleashed with the Anthropocene, it's just over, you know. We're not going to reappropriate in the sense of fully control it. But, you know, we might still readopt it. So there might be a way of repairing, or that's, in a way, that's if there is a way, it's a way of repairing some of the damage that is already done and sort of rejoining some of the relations that regenerate life. And so I think this sort of readoption of the subjected and discarded describes or kind of points very clearly to the sites at which activism is most vigorous at the moment. And the first step is always just the kind of bare minimum, the kind of saving the most precarious and most assaulted lives. But you know, if you live and then you're immediately sucked back into an exploitative and exhausting machinery, then that doesn't do enough. So then you need something like the care revolution that adopts all our capacities for repair that have been split off and devalued. And also repairing only works if you actually have access to staff. So things from small occupations to ideas of socializing certain key infrastructures, producing certain type of public luxury, all point to the hope that some fundamental goods could be shared and could be accessible to all instead of sort of monopolized by the very few oligarchs, or who anyway then hopefully go to Mars one day. And the last thing is, of course, even if we readopted the goods and the riches of the world, we need to maintain them, you know. The stuff needs to constantly be repaired, cherished, held in existence. We know now that, everything will take a lot of labor just to even keep functioning under more and more difficult planetary conditions of life. And that's kind of the opposite of the property relation I started off with, of the object relation of property. It's the opposite relation to things. And when people defend property, which I understand, of course, in the world of property, it's much better to have it than not to have it. It's very scary to think it away. Then often it comes from an impulse precisely not of realizing that institution in the sense of entitlement to destroy, of dominion, but in the sense of, well, I want to care for something. Like, I love my garden. I want to look after it. I know better what's good for it than anyone else. And this impulse to maintain objects and have stewardship over ecosystems, that could be a very different object relation. It could even allow us not to just abolish property, but to, revolutionize it, make it into something different, from which then there could at least be, some bonds of repaired and regenerated life that is much richer than the attempt to continue living constantly off the splitting off and cutting off of other life. I guess that was quite a last sentence, and I'm done with my time. So maybe we leave it at that, and I'm sure that with the questions we can also come back a bit more concretely to the political situation we are in right now. Thank you very much for listening to so much philosophy.
Thank you so much for a very engaging talk. And I want to continue where you left us in your talk at the resistance.
Yes, great.
Because a thesis that you develop in your book that you also shared here is that we see an awful lot of forms of resistance against the capitalist property regime in which we live, varying from Black Lives Matter, anti-feminist, feminist movements against feminicide, indeed solidarity movements with Gaza, but also Extinction Rebellion, animal rights activists perhaps. And you say the thesis you develop is what they have in common is life as a point of reference. And what I would like to start with is the question, like, this shared reference to life, is that a concept? Is that just a concept that reappears in these different struggles? Is it kind of like a signifier, as we call it as philosophers, or is there something more substantive in this idea of life that they appeal to? In other words, basically, in your argument, what is life? That sounds like an awful big question to ask.
No, it's great.
What is life in this context?
Life is all the different regenerative tides. It's an ensemble of tides. It's an ensemble of lots of different metabolic cycles. So that's a very materialist concept, and I want to defend quite a substantive concept of life. And I completely agree with you. I also started out being like, funny, they all speak about life. And then the more you look, then also the Zapatistas do, and of course, the Kurdish movement does, and then, also the resistance against Hamas in Gaza before October 7th, and now they call themselves a movement for life. It's and of course you could be like, what's more generic? Like, that's just the broadest common, who doesn't want to live? Well, actually, but it's quite a broad term. Probably it means nothing. But then, even if get rid of that even. If you look at the ways that within the movements the term gets articulated, I find it really fascinating how rich it gets. So how, for instance, in Black Lives Matter, there is this idea of, for instance, from borrowing from Ruth Wilson Gilmore, where life is precious, life is precious. And there's this whole idea that only where life can be kind of appreciated, connected, nourished, only there can we also live together in a sort of productive and peaceful way. And the emphasis on solidarity, but not just as a kind of abstract, I take your side, but solidarity as a kind of reciprocal need orientation, which is kind of a very Marxist concept in a way, that comes back in a lot of those concepts. And also with the feminist movements, I mean, they really have a vision of the need orientation that is already there in care work, but of course in sort of distorted, devalued and forms. But when there is talk of life in those movements, it usually means something that is a negation of what I would call propertized control. It's a sort of excess of care and belonging, and also something somewhat wild, you know. Like, I found that very interesting, and then I thought more about it philosophically, where I think life in the older philosophical tradition often is something that is kind of seen as one force. It's sort of vitalism, you know, or vitalism, how do you pronounce that? And today, we have and also all those movements have almost the opposite concept of life. It's something very fragile. It's really precarious. We worry for the first time in world history that life on the planet might actually not be strong enough to survive us. So it's not the kind of life concept of somebody like Nietzsche, but that's why I like this idea of a sort of intricate web of ensembles of things that need to regenerate each other. And of course, this emphasis on diversity and pluralism and lots of contemporary activism also goes with the way that life is something very manifold. It's not one thing. It's definitely not a forceful drive. It's a very sort of precious fabric that holds things together. And yeah, maybe we can get to that later. That I think one can distinguish it quite well also from how the right does their politics of life. Because they only want life enclosed as it was under domination. When they say life, they mean the womb of a woman that doesn't belong to the woman. It's a kind of, that's propertized life. And those social movements, I think, point to the hope of a depropertized life.
One gets the impression, hearing you about life, also reading your book, that the movements are in a way also informed by a sense of grief or loss of life.
Yeah.
And you speak also about lots of examples of loss of individuals, loss of human beings, loss of our environment, our natural environment. How is that typical to these kind of contemporary social movements? How does loss of life or the threat of losing it or grief for the loss of life, how does that play a role in this kind of politics?
I think it's probably what makes them more, I would say, human and less sort of fervently fanatical, that there is this sense of there will be stuff that we can't rescue. I mean, also so much horrible things have happened already in history. But that, I think if you have an emancipatory vision of politics, then the question is not just one of winning or losing. There's actually something better. There's something about, is it meaningful or not? And those situations of loss often shake you back into, knowing what really matters. I mean, that sounds, but yeah, I think that's as basic as I would want to put it. So I think I think there are some tacky forms, and I mean, I also make some fun in the book of people who make a procession pretending they're deer. That is some of that is maybe too theatrical, but also who am I to judge? But the attempt to face the fragility of life can also make you fight for it harder, but also understand, and I think that's what I try to do with this concept of world readoption, understand that fighting is not what makes life alive. Like, there's a lot more that has to happen. Like, you actually have to labor. There are lots of very sort of modest everyday activities that make the fabric of life hold up. often the fighting actually is also another way of ending it.
You already referred to this, but I mean, life as a central issue for all these movements. Initially, when I read your book, that's something that, in a way, also surprised me, because life plays such a role in, also arguably a role, at least at the superficial level, in a rather conservative or reactionary discourse.
Yeah.
I mean, of course, one of the most well-known anti-feminist movements.
Marches for Life.
The pro-life movement against abortion. I mean, they would, at a superficial level, at least, happily endorse probably your message about life. So what distinguishes?
You're welcome. If they stay, they might have to change.
what distinguishes these movements from? So when does a politics of life become revolutionary?
Yeah.
Because there are arguably also very anti-revolutionary movements that also see themselves, quite generally perhaps, as protective of life.
Yeah, great question, thank you. So I think here we really see that I don't think life is an empty signifier, and I don't think we can have it. And I think that's maybe a high philosophical hope, but I think there is a way of sort of clarifying or substantiating concepts to the point where you can see that your embrace of it sort of makes more sense. And I think we are really losing so much ground on the left of sort of shying away from polluted concepts. And I mean, right now we are losing freedom as well. Like that, we can't just let that happen just because it works for the fascists. We can't, we just have to say what freedom is instead, right? And same for life. So just because some anti-abortion fanatics have a march for life doesn't mean they now have copyright on the concept of life. And how do I distinguish it? I do think that and sometimes I'm surprised how well it works. I'm sure there are examples where it doesn't work anymore, but I would say no right-wing appeal to life is universal and is relational in this sort of liberated, depropertized way. They always, when they say life, they mean life enclosed as it used to be. And life, that's part of the enclosure, kind of under the control of who is a worthy owner according to sort of old regimes of violence. So the woman herself, she cannot have a say on whether or not she reproduces. And then, there was some legal reform. It's not like the husband or somebody who can decide, but then at least the state should decide. Like there should be laws. She shouldn't decide. So this whole focus on the embryo is such a good example of what I said at the beginning, was you see things separated, but that's not their real nature. I mean, that doesn't exist. Like you don't have an embryo that isn't together with a pregnant body. So that this is not life. This is one cut out piece of life that was historically propertized to the end of a certain type of control, and that situation, patriarchal control. And I think that's the same with appeals to right-wing ecology is usually about protecting a certain area for some people, but not for people. And then often it's even very quickly slides into protecting it against the wrong type of people who shouldn't be there. And so there's always this sort of allocation to certain groups and not a vision of how we could make all life thrive better. And I do think that that's the test, and it's not that just because something calls itself left, it automatically lives up to that standard. So I'm actually, in a way, this is a very liberal argument that I'm making, even though, of course, we have to also protect liberalism against fascist onslaught. But I think we can do better. I don't think that it's a great strategy to, as a feminist, for instance, then resort to the progressive propertization and be like, as in German we say, my belly belongs to me. There's something wrong about a world where bellies are property in the first place. And as long as that sounds odd if you say it, but not if I say it. That already shows that we haven't kind of moved beyond that. And also the right learns, now in Italy, they've changed the whole thing. It's not, so they say, Meloni would say, yeah, sure, your belly is yours. Just it so happens I've closed all abortion clinics. So, with your body, you can go and pay like 10,000 euro to travel to Holland. Like if you can't afford it, your problem. And also you can say, well, your belly is yours, but the embryo owns itself as well. So then what do you do? Only because I own my garden, it's not like I'm allowed to shoot a child there. So you can always kind of get back because it remains particular. It's not a vision for everyone. So how could we say people should decide about the way that they spend their lifetime? How about that? Everybody should that connects me with the lorry driver who has shitty shifts, and it's also maybe my wish to not have children. So I think we have to also try not to just fence in our own progressive achievements in this propertized logic. Though of course sometimes you try what helps, but I do think it stops working pretty quickly and it's not an emancipatory vision.
So is it could you phrase it as it's life as something bounded versus like an unbounded? You used the word wild before.
Yeah.
Unbounded, expansive life form.
And when I say wild there, I don't mean wild in some kind of originary jungle kind of fantasy of wild, but I was inspired by the fact that so in the US South under slavery, there was one of the most effective forms of resistance was so-called marooning, where people fled from the plantations and lived often in very hidden places, sort of subsistence agriculture, also sort of helped other slaves escape. And they were called maroon communities, and maroon is a word that comes from the Spanish cimarron, which is used for runaway cattle. So they used to be propertized, but now they're free. So that's the movement. It's sort of beyond the property form, not back before. And I don't know. In my new book, I don't say wild anymore, but maybe when I read it there, I always like it. And wild things, they're not just sort of stomping everything down. That's again, wild means you have an ecosystem in which things reproduce each other, where you can have the deer and the grass and the wolf, but they can all live.
Yeah. Let's go to the actual resistance. So so life is the aim, you could say, that which the resistance seeks to protect. It's also, if I understand you correctly, kind of its source, or its and it takes many forms.
The more there is, the better we can all sustain each other. Yeah.
Your argument seems to be underpinned by an ontology that in which I think in your book you phrase it as everything we need is already there.
Yeah.
That resistance is not something that has to first acquire a certain capacity to resist, but something that already has its ability, let's say, to resist capital or to resist these forms of properties. Can you say a bit more about that? How come that? How do you see resistance and its sources or its origin?
I find it very difficult to do. So, no, I don't want to be too tempted to romanticize resistance in the sense of, so I generally have nothing against romanticization. I mean, this society celebrates Valentine's Day, so let us romanticize nature and resistance and all sorts of things. But I think it doesn't do any service to resistance at a point where most people are totally exhausted and burned out, and this exhaustion is actually what connects us with almost all life, even with the most privileged, like the heart attack of the manager is kind of on the side of the revolution in a way, and the other bits of the manager aren't. So there is this profound yearning just for recovery, and not just, and maybe that just the drive to finally once sleep enough might be more of a revolutionary source at the moment, because it really reminds us of, okay, we need to organize things differently. We need to, like a lot of things, we just need to stop doing for the world and its livability to get better. So that I think you have to start with what indeed is there, and that's not sort of all the energy and all the things we need. It's actually the tiredness, the exhaustion that is there. But I do think saying everything we need is there is important, because, I mean, in a way that's what makes a materialist position, that you work with the world as it is, and you don't say, oh, there's this completely other world, and if we have enough of a will, then somehow we get there, or the chosen few might get there or something. But it's like, no, it's what's here already, and if it's not enough, we have to look more closely. But I don't think we have everything in the sense of the things that are already there are in the right place. No, often they're in the very wrong place. And, you know, the oil should be in the ground and not being drilled, and the pools should be public and not on the rooftop of a millionaire's villa, and like lots of things aren't where they should be. But and lots of our capacities to live differently need to be invented and trained. And yet, I think, you know, it comes from this. I said that to you before. I love Gustav Landauer. He's a very unknown German anarchist thinker from 100 years ago, and more than 100 years ago. He said this thing: why do you want to go and let yourself be killed for socialism? It's not there yet. Why don't you just try to live as a socialist? Just try a tiny bit, like, and then go and fight for it. And somehow, when I first read that, it made such an impression on me that there's always a bit more we can already realize now. Yeah.
This is an idea that arguably has gained a lot of prominence, right, in activist discourses and repertoires. What's often referred to as prefiguration, the idea that the alternative is not there in the future for us to realize, but something that could already be practiced, albeit in a small form, in the here and now, or in...
Do you still see that? I saw that 5 years ago, but now I do feel there's also a very widespread sense of despair and fury that thinks this world just has to be destroyed. I hope you're right, and I'm definitely preaching for that approach. I'm not sure it's that prevalent anymore.
It lost traction, you think?
Yeah, I think we've sort of tipped into a darker mode of self-defense, which is like, lest we eliminate our enemies, they will eliminate us. I don't know. It's all obviously there are many different things. This book sort of tries to emphasize one strand.
And of course, I mean, your book, you've written it a few years ago, right? So, and indeed, a lot has happened in the meantime. Trump became president again. There was the genocide in Gaza, and etc. The war in Ukraine. There's many examples, of course, of things that happened in the meantime. So how does that affect your thesis on life?
Yeah.
Is it heading in a different direction, in the wrong direction, perhaps?
I do think, well, maybe I'm biased and I find it too plausible, but I do think that it's still a useful lens on movements. And as I also just said, I do think also the mobilization for Gaza could be seen as a revolution for life type of politics. I do think that we've lost, I don't even know, but in this kind of feeling of the horizon really closing in, some of the prefigurative experimentation, in my perception, have actually closed. Like, maybe I'm just not following it well enough, I don't know, but I've also seen a lot of part of the German movements that to me seemed to very much embody the spirit of revolution for life. They have somewhat disintegrated, and also partly due to what I would call this kind of progressive property politics, where you either have this stance or that stance, and you can't you just infinitely find about the boundaries of that, and not somehow the broader transformative project gets out of sight. Though you could, of course, say all those fights are prefigurative, like it matters. So I do think we've moved to a place of sort of more bitter self-defense of life rather than a sort of prefiguration of other ways of living. And I mean, sometimes it's like that. It's not just, I mean, movements don't decide there's a counter revolution and they fight or they react or they are exhausted. And I think with there is now, I think in the US also starts to be small attempts also to do exactly this sort of, sanctuaries, helping people not to get deported. Like I think that would be part of the same trajectory. So we got to see. I mean, nothing in that book says that we're going to win.
No.
There's not.
No, you in fact, I mean, no. You invoke, of course, the image of Walter Benjamin of revolution as an emergency brake, an attempt to pull the emergency brake rather than as an attempt to get ahead of things.
Yes, but also I think this is in some sense still like people love repeating it, but it's a too lazy image because we can't just stop. That's the thing. There's so much destruction that will continue even if we stop now. That's why I think there has to be this kind of reparative counter movement. We can't stop. We actually have to work in the other direction. Like that, it has to be a kind of reparative or world readopting activity that actively overcomes and heals and re-stitches some of the splits that have occurred. And it will be there will be tough decisions to make, where to focus, what to give up.
But before going there, because I think that's a very important point about repairing I mean, you addressed these previous movements of the past years, some of which have disappeared, some of which have been dismissed as failures. I also wanted to ask you about failure. So how do we appreciate movements? And there are many examples, including many of the examples that you mentioned, of movements that are now perceived as perhaps promising moments at the time, but they didn't lead to anything. Is that how we should look at them, or is there something else coming from your perspective?
That maybe goes back to this question of, is it meaningful? Does it make sense? So I both object to an image of politics that equates hope with the likelihood of winning. Like, I think that's a complete, it's not a horse bet or something. We do something because we think it's right and history is open. We don't know what will happen. But I also think, indeed, romanticization of failure is terrible. Like this Beckett line, fail better, no. Like people die because people get traumatized because of failure. We don't want to fail. We want to at least somehow survive and actually ideally live. So I think one way to address that question is to say that if you're part of an emancipatory political project, you have the great advantage over your enemies that you can look back on history, you can look at struggles that you lost and think it would have been better to be on that side. Like, it would have been better to be a Paris communard than a Prussian soldier shooting them. It would be better being Rosa Luxemburg or Gustav Landauer than to be the right-wing militia that killed them. Even though the other guys won. But, still somehow it's not only that we think they were evil, we somehow think that was the less rich life. It's not who you would want to be. And that, I think, maybe that even goes back to your question about mourning, which I didn't say much about when you asked it, that this way of embodying also the past losses makes for a very for a richer life, even though it's also sad. But that gives you a sort of orientation in the struggles at the moment. That is, of course you need to try to convince people and win. That's what, otherwise it's not a struggle. But it doesn't let some external criterion decide the failure entirely. Like, it wasn't a wasted life, but it was still a failed revolution.
So the category of success or failure in that sense is
Yeah.
perhaps the wrong one to use.
Yeah. Yeah, and also, who are we? I mean, so much. What is the idea of politics where you think, oh, all those struggles have failed? Like, there was the Shoah, like horrible things happened in history. Oh, but this time we do it right. Oh, now we've abolished fossil capitalism. I mean, I had some people in the German Fridays for Future who, I mean, it's great that they're there. Even now they've become really ineffective because of the way that also the discourse has moved on. But one of the young activists said to me, like, we thought that after 5 years this would all be solved. And it's like, wow, I mean, I don't know what they learn in school, that's what you think. But and also sometimes you need, but in some way I don't think that's what you need. I think then you just get really disappointed when you see that you haven't changed the world with 5 demonstrations. Of course you haven't.
So I mean, what then is revolution in your understanding of it?
Well, a very, very long process. And something of which we cannot tell what it is before way later. So I think it's, in a way, revolution is all the connections between the different practices that aim for liberation and for repair. And it's an unending task. That's what makes it also fulfilling. But it has a certain trajectory that would allow it to continue also in breadth and include everyone. Like, that's the difference from some sort of impossible ambitious project, but which doesn't aim to eventually make life better for all. I think that is something we need to stick to, that it would be better, even for that manager with his heart problem, he would be better off in a revolution for life. Not that he's the first we should care about, but that's the beauty of an emancipatory project.
Would you see it as an open-ended process?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I do think that some things can get substantially better, and it's not like, if we ended fossil extraction, that would be, one could be like, that's a success, like we've really achieved something now. But the work wouldn't be over, never, no. Because I do think living a free life is a certain type of labor for the animals we are. So it will never be over. And I do think, so if you think of the human rights tradition, then there is an idea of you have certain rights, and then if they're recognized and the state guarantees them, then you're done, sort of. And I don't think that's how it works. I think it's not that we have individual rights and they get sanctioned, it's that we, in the way we organize our mutual relations, give each other more and more freedom, and that is open-ended. It can get better and better. I mean, we probably haven't seen it even yet, how good it could get. So in that sense, then it's never over.